I used to think the worst thing that could happen to a family was losing the house. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a lot of things in those weeks before I understood what was coming through our walls. But that particular misconception, that the bank and the foreclosure notice and the sick bright glow of a bankruptcy webpage at 2 in the morning were the sharpest dangers we faced, that one I held longest. I held it the way you hold something familiar when the world goes strange. The way you grip the wheel after the car starts to slide. My name is Madison Lane. At the time this happened, I was 37 years old. I had two children, Jacob, who was 14 and made of equal parts grief and fury, and Haley, who was 9 and still believed that things, generally speaking, worked out. I was 2 months behind on the mortgage. I was working double shifts at the clinic. The overtime wasn't enough. The overtime was never going to be enough. My ex-husband had left us with debt I hadn't even known existed, and the house we lived in, a wide, pale structure on the quiet end of Crestwood Lane, with peeling paint above the garage, and a backyard Jacob had stopped using after his father left, that house was going to be taken from us. I had accepted that, more or less. I was grieving it in the practical way you grieve something that hasn't happened yet, preparing myself, doing the math on apartments, counting bedrooms, calculating commutes. The grief was clean in the way that financial grief can be clean. It was a fixed, countable loss. It had a number on it and a deadline and a form you could file. I understood it. I could plan around it. That kind of loss is hard, but hard and nameable is something a person can carry if she's determined enough, and I had always been determined enough. My children had inherited that from me, or so I told myself. Jacob had the determination mixed with his father's temper, and the grief of a boy who had watched his father choose to leave, and the combination made him difficult in ways I understood and ways I did not. But underneath all of it was the same stubborn refusal to be broken that had kept me upright for 3 years. Haley had it quieter. She had the kind of resilience that presents itself as cheerfulness, as a habit of finding the manageable part of any situation and focusing on that. She was 9. It was still charming at 9. The light started in October. The first time I thought it was an electrical fault, a pulse of white like a fluorescent tube sputtering behind the walls. It came from the kitchen, and by the time I got there was nothing, just the refrigerator hum and the sink dripping and the particular silence of a house where everyone is pretending to be asleep. I checked the breakers, all of them, one by one, in the utility closet off the garage, with a flashlight I held in my teeth. Everything was fine. I went back to bed. I told myself the house was old, and old houses did strange things, and in the morning I would call an electrician. In the morning I did not call an electrician because I could not afford an electrician, and also because in the morning it seemed less urgent, the way things that happen at 2 in the morning always seem less urgent in daylight. Life had a way of making its daytime concerns louder than its nighttime ones. Jacob had been called to the principal's office again. A fight, the third in 6 weeks, another boy with a bruised jaw, and a story that did not reflect particularly well on my son. Haley needed a costume for a school event on Friday that I had not had on my calendar. The clinic called about a scheduling change. The day swallowed the night. The second time, Jacob was in the room when it happened. He was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework he wasn't actually doing. The book was open and the pencil was in his hand, and his eyes were at the wall, which was how Jacob studied when he was not studying. I came in from the hallway with the intention of asking him something I've since forgotten. The light hit before I could speak. That same white pulse, brighter this time, substantially brighter, blooming from the center of the room like something detonating at close range. It lit the underside of Jacob's face and threw his shadow hard against the wall behind him, and then was gone in under a second. Jacob shoved his chair back so hard it cracked against the cabinets. He was on his feet before I reached him. His jaw was set in the way it's set when he was fighting, not the active jaw set of someone about to swing, but the preparatory one, the held breath one, the one that meant he was deciding whether this was the kind of thing you could fight or the kind of thing you simply had to survive. He didn't ask what it was. He just looked at the space where the light had been, and something moved behind his eyes that I did not want to name. "Go to your room," I said. "What was that?" "I don't know yet. Room Jacob, please." He went, not because I'd convinced him, but because he could see I was scared, and when Jacob saw someone he loved was scared, something in him decided to be still. That was always his way. Anger on the outside, stillness underneath, as if the anger were a coat he wore over a more careful self. I didn't know then what that stillness would cost him. The investigators came 3 days later. I'd found them online. A referral through a neighbor who'd had, she said, a similar problem 2 years back in the house she'd lived in before the Crestwood Lane one, before she'd moved, and the problem had apparently stopped. She offered the referral with a nervous qualification I did not fully process at the time. Looking back, I understand she was telling me something she hadn't figured out how to say directly. But I was a woman who needed a solution, and the referral was a solution-shaped thing, so I called. 2 men. They came with equipment cases and the careful, practiced expressions of people who had learned to manage other people's fear without absorbing it. They spent 4 hours in the house with their monitors and their recorders and their signal detectors, moving through the rooms in a systematic pattern, pausing in doorways, lingering in the kitchen, spending an unusual amount of time in the hallway outside Jacob's room. When they came to find me in the kitchen, where I was sitting with cold coffee and a cordless phone I didn't know who I was planning to call, they looked shaken in a way that professional calm couldn't quite cover. The taller one had a whiteness around the mouth. The shorter one kept his eyes on the table. The taller one set a small recorder on the table between us. He pressed play. What came out of the speaker was a sound I will not try to reproduce in any precise way, because precision fails it. It was low and cyclical and wrong in a structural sense. Wrong the way a chord is wrong when one note is tuned a quarter step off from where it belongs. It was wrong the way a voice sounds wrong when heard through a wall that is too thin, not distorted enough to be unintelligible, but distorted enough that you can't be sure what it's saying. It made the back teeth ache. It made the air feel thick in the throat. "We'd recommend you take the children and leave," the shorter one said. "For how long?" The two of them looked at each other. "We're not going to be coming back," the taller one said. He sounded apologetic in the way that people sound apologetic when apologizing is all they have to offer. "I'm sorry." They left their card on the table. I never called the number on it. There didn't seem to be any point. Men who weren't coming back were telling me to run, and I had nowhere to run to, and also, and this is the thing I come back to, examining my own decisions in those weeks, I did not fully believe it. Not yet. I was still in the part of the story where the rational explanation was more comfortable than the actual one. And I was a woman who had survived 3 years of practical disasters by locating the rational explanation and addressing it methodically. And that habit of mind was hard to break even when it wasn't serving me. What I did instead was call Nikolai. He was not officially my boyfriend. That word felt too young for what we had, which was something quieter and more careful. A man I had let into the house in stages, who cooked without being asked and never raised his voice and understood, without my having to explain it, that Jacob needed time and that rushing him would accomplish nothing. He'd come into our lives through the clinic, where he occasionally volunteered on weekends, and the first thing he'd done for Jacob was show up to a school science fair where I'd been the only parent, sit with my son for 40 minutes, and talk to him about his project with the unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere else to be. Jacob had been suspicious of him for 6 months after that. Then one evening they'd spent 3 hours in the backyard looking at something through an old telescope Nikolai had brought without fanfare, and when they came in, Jacob had the particular quiet of a boy who had been treated with respect by an adult male and didn't yet know what to do with that information. Nikolai was a research physicist. He had spent 11 years at a private laboratory he didn't talk about much, doing work he described, when pressed, as applied temporal mechanics. I hadn't known what that meant. I hadn't asked. There were parts of Nikolai's life before me that he kept behind a particular stillness of his own, and I had respected that the way he respected mine. When I showed him the recording, he went very quiet. Not the quiet of a man who doesn't know what to say. The quiet of a man who knows exactly what he's hearing and is deciding how much to tell me. Nikolai. He set the recorder down. He put both hands flat on the table, palms down, and he looked at them for a moment with a precision of attention that told me he was thinking very carefully about the next thing he said. I need to look at something, he said. I need to look at the house. He brought equipment the next afternoon. Not paranormal investigator equipment, nothing with ghost hunting written on the case, nothing theatrical or speculative in its design. A frequency analyzer in a gray, foam-lined case. A portable field detector that he had built himself. He said, from components that shouldn't technically have been available to a private citizen, assembled on his kitchen table over 2 years of evenings he described to me as hobby work without. I now understood, being specific about the nature of the hobby. He moved through the rooms in a systematic grid, and I followed him, and Haley followed me as she always did when she was uncertain, tucked close, and Jacob leaned in doorways with his arms crossed and his face closed, watching. The readings, Nikolai told me that evening, were consistent with what he called a temporal fold. He used that phrase carefully, the way you use words you know sound impossible, and are trying to introduce without triggering the defensive reflex that impossible things trigger in practical people. I asked him to explain it plainly. He did. It took a long time, and he was careful and thorough in his explanation, circling back to confirm I'd understood each piece before adding the next, the way you explain something to someone whose understanding you actually care about as opposed to someone you're just informing. The short version, the version I could hold in my head and actually use, was this. Someone somewhere was conducting experiments with folded space-time, teleportation. The kind of research that had been theoretical for decades, confined to academic papers and speculative mathematics, and was now apparently not theoretical at all. And those experiments were bleeding. They were leaking. The energy they produced was anchoring itself to certain locations, certain structural coordinates, certain homes, and the fold points were becoming unstable, which meant things could come through them. Things? What things? I said. Nikolai looked at his hands. Test subjects, he said. The research requires human subjects. When the fold is unstable, the subjects don't arrive where they're supposed to. They arrive here. They arrive then. Then, the past, our present, here. I sat with that for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a dog barked twice and stopped. The lights. Arrival events. And the whatever Jacob and I saw, the figure. A test subject, Nikolai said. Displaced. Brain function compromised by repeated transit. They come through without context, without orientation. They're violent because they're afraid, because they don't know where or when they are, and because the transit process itself does damage, cumulative damage. The more transits, the worse. What kind of damage? He was quiet. Nikolai, what kind of damage are we talking about? Cognitive, he said finally, structural, the kind that can't be repaired with any intervention available to us. He paused. The kind that progresses. What company? I said. What company is running these experiments? He said a name I'd seen on the bankruptcy research I'd been doing. The company that had made an offer on our house, a low offer, below market even in the depressed market we were in, submitted through a property management intermediary that I'd traced back, in one of my late-night research sessions, to a larger parent company I hadn't recognized. CamSET. It was on the acquisition paperwork. It was on the foreclosure-related mail I'd been letting stack unopened, because opening it made it more real. He said it the way you say the name of something you've been trying not to say out loud. You worked for them, I said. Yes. For 11 years. Yes, and you knew what they were doing. The silence that followed was the longest he had ever let stand between us. Outside, the dog had stopped. A car passed on Crestwood Lane, its headlights sweeping briefly across the kitchen window and continuing. The refrigerator cycled off and the kitchen became very quiet. I knew the theory, he said. I knew the direction of the research. I believed they were years from anything operational. He stopped. I didn't know they'd gotten this far. I didn't know they were using people. I believed him. I don't know that I should have, not completely, but I did. There was a quality to his stillness in that moment that I recognized from the months I'd known him. It was the same stillness I'd seen in Jacob when he heard something that hurt him deeply and decided not to show it. Nikolai was a man who had just learned something about himself that he would spend the rest of his life accounting for. That recognition was not a rational basis for trust. But I had it, and I held it, and it turned out to be right. I told him to figure out how to stop it. He said he would try. The third arrival happened 4 nights later. It came at 2 in the morning, which had become the hour I associated with arrivals. Not because they only came at 2, but because 2 in the morning was when the house was at its quietest, and I was at my most alert, trained by 3 previous events into a kind of vigilant light sleep from which any sound or change in the air would pull me upright. The light first, that white pulse, filling the downstairs the way light fills a room when a door is open to bright sun, instantaneous and total. And then the sound, which was not the recording sound but something physical and directional, a kind of concussive displacement that you felt in the sternum more than heard with the ears, as if the air had been briefly and violently rearranged. I was awake before it fully resolved. I was in the hallway barefoot by the time the light faded. He was standing in the living room. I will describe him as he appeared then, because I want you to understand what I was working with in those first seconds, before context arrived and changed everything. He was tall, well over 6 feet, and he wore the remains of a white garment that might have been a medical gown or a jumpsuit, reduced to rags by some combination of transit stress and time I couldn't calculate. His face it was not right, not in any simple way. The proportions were correct in a clinical sense, but the skin had the look of something that had been under severe and sustained stress, a tightness and a pallor that was beyond illness, beyond any ordinary injury. There were scars on his skull, old ones, patterned in a way that suggested surgical precision, deliberate placement, deliberate quantity, not the product of accident. His eyes were open, but the focus in them was not the focus of a person looking at a room. It was the focus of an animal that has been made to hurt long enough that hurting is all it remembers, all it expects, all it is prepared for. He moved before I could speak. Not toward me, toward the sound of Haley, who had come to the top of the stairs. I moved faster. I don't know how. I was not a fast person under ordinary circumstances. I was tired in a bone-deep way that had nothing to do with the hour and everything to do with the sustained low-grade emergency of the preceding weeks. But I put myself between him and the staircase with a speed I don't have a clean explanation for, and I put my hands up, both of them open, not a threat, a boundary, and I said, I remember this specifically and have thought about it many times since. I said, stop. He stopped. Not because of any force, not because the word had power in any supernatural sense. He stopped because something in him, some buried mechanism, still responded to a human voice speaking human words with human authority. The damage had not gone all the way down to that. He stopped and he looked at me, and there was a moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, where I thought I saw something behind the deterioration, something that recognized me, something that was trying, through whatever was left of its higher cognition, to understand where it was. Then Nikolai came from the kitchen with the field suppressor he'd been building and carrying since the previous evening, and the thing that had been a man made a sound like fracturing glass and swung at me, and I went down hard against the sofa, and the whole house seemed to breathe inward with the impact of his arrival finally fully registering on the structure. Nikolai got between us. He had the suppressor running, a handheld device, roughly the size and shape of a power drill, built from the same components he'd used for the field detector but configured in reverse, designed, he'd explained, to emit a low-frequency pulse that would destabilize the fold anchor enough to force a return transit. He held it up, and the device emitted its pulse with a sound that was almost below hearing, felt more in the jaw than registered by the ears. The figure in white looked at it with those ruined eyes, looked at it with the particular attention of something that recognized a threat even through the damage. And then it was gone. The same white light it had arrived in, contained and total and over in under a second. The living room smelled of ozone and something older and unnameable, the smell I associated now specifically with the arrivals, the smell that had become the olfactory signature of danger in a way I suspected would take a long time to untangle. I sat on the floor against the sofa for a long time. Jacob was in the doorway to the kitchen. He had seen all of it. He had a kitchen knife in his hand, held down at his side, and his face was completely still in that deep way that meant he had moved past the fight-or-flee reflex and into the territory beyond it, where the situation was too large for either response and the body simply waits. "Put that down," I said. He set it on the counter without argument. He came and sat on the floor beside me. He didn't say anything. After a while, Haley came down the stairs in her socks and her pajamas with the small print on them and sat on my other side, and the three of us sat there in the dark while Nikolai moved through the house taking readings and muttering to himself. And outside on Crestwood Lane, the neighborhood slept through whatever it had just missed. Haley took my hand. Jacob did not, but his shoulder was against mine. I stayed on that floor longer than I needed to. There was nowhere else I particularly wanted to be. In the days that followed, I began to understand the shape of our situation. The fold was anchored to the house. Nikolai had confirmed this through a full day of measurements, cross-referenced against the CamSET data he'd begun to carefully extract through old access credentials he'd held onto after his departure, credentials that apparently still functioned. The anchor was not to us specifically, not yet, but the stability of the anchor was degrading. Each arrival event weakened the local structure. Each weakening made the next arrival more likely and potentially more severe. The subjects coming through were in escalating states of deterioration. What we had seen so far, the figure in white, violent but still governable by a human voice, still capable of a kind of recognition, was, Nikolai believed, one of the earlier subjects in the sequence at a relatively early point in his transit history. The later subjects and the same subjects at later stages would be worse. And then he told me the rest of it. There was a reason, he said, that the fold had chosen our house. Fold points were not entirely random. They sought certain structural and, he suspected, biological resonances. CamSET's research had revealed, and this was research that had not been published, had not been disclosed, had been buried in proprietary data he'd spent 3 weeks quietly accessing, that temporal resonance was partially hereditary, that some people produced it naturally, passively, without any external input, that it could be detected in children and was strongest in adolescence, strongest during periods of high emotional stress, strongest in subjects who were already predisposed toward the kind of neurological intensity that manifests as anger or exceptional perception, or both, simultaneously. "Jacob," I said. "I believe so, yes. He's been having those episodes at school. The anger, the fights, That's separate. That's grief and frustration and a 14-year-old boy who lost his father and hasn't got a good outlet for it. But the resonance is something else entirely. It's passive. He doesn't choose it. It's physiological, like blood type. It's just there. And CamSET knows. They don't know it's him specifically by name, by face. But they know there's a resonance source in this house. It's part of why they want to buy it. They want the location. The fold isn't an accident of geography. It's anchored here because Jacob is here. Remove Jacob, and the anchor may transfer to wherever he goes. Sell the house, and CamSET has a controlled fold point in a property they own." I looked at my hands where they rested on the kitchen table. They were very steady. That surprised me. I had expected them to shake. "So they're going to keep coming," I said. "Yes, until we leave or until they buy the house and remove us." "Yes, and if we leave, the anchor may transfer. We don't know for certain. If it's Jacob, then yes, potentially anywhere he goes." "Can you close it?" He was quiet for too long. "Nikolai, can you close it? Is that something you can do from this side?" "Not from this end," he said. "The anchor is on the other side of the fold. It's maintained by the generation equipment in the CamSET facility, wherever that facility is located in the forward timeline. To close it, someone would need to reach the generation equipment. Someone would need to go through." The fourth arrival came the following night, and the fifth 2 nights after that. Each one was worse than the last. The fourth was a woman, or had been once. She was younger than me, or had been younger than me at whatever point CamSET had taken her. Her transit damage was severe enough that she could not stand fully upright, could not hold her head at any angle that permitted normal sight, moved in a lurching lateral pattern that reminded me of something I had seen once in a nature documentary. An animal with neurological damage crossing a field in diagonal lines, as if the coordinates of its destination kept shifting. She did not respond to voice at all. Not to mine, not to Nikolai's, not to Jacob's, who tried from the kitchen doorway before I told him sharply to get back. She moved through the dining room breaking things, not with intent but with indifference, the way water moves through obstacles, until Nikolai suppressed her and she went the way they all went. The handprint she left on the dining room wall was in something that was not quite blood and not quite anything I had a name for. I painted over it the next morning. I needed to do something I could finish. Jacob put his fist through his bedroom door that night. Not at us. Not at anything specific. Just at the door in private where he thought no one would hear. He didn't cry. Jacob had stopped crying in any sustained way after his father left, had redirected all of it sideways into anger, into the fights at school, into the fist through the door at 2 in the morning when things were too large and too formless to be addressed any other way. I heard it. I sat on the floor in the hallway outside his room, my back against the wall, my knees up, in the position I had come to think of as my position for waiting. I did not knock. He needed it to be private, and knocking would have told him I'd heard, and if he knew I'd heard, he would close down further. So I sat. I was there on the other side of the door, and he knew this house well enough to know I was likely there, and that knowing was its own kind of communication. After a while, he opened the door. He stood there looking down at me with the broken hand. Not broken. I would find out the next morning, just bruised, 2 knuckles swollen and dark. And his face had the wrung-out quality of someone who has been angry past the point of anger and come out the other side into something quieter and harder to name. "Are we going to be okay?" he said. "Yes," I said. I was lying. I believed I was lying. But you say it anyway because you are the parent and saying it is part of what you owe them. You say it and you make yourself mean it, and then you go figure out how to make it true. You figure out how to make it true or you die trying. And those are the only 2 options available to you, and you choose the first one every time, because that is what it means to be the adult in the room. The fifth arrival was the man in white again. Same figure, same white gown reduced to rags, same surgical scars on the skull patterned and precise. But this time the damage was worse. There was a visible wound now along the jaw that had not been there before, a deep laceration still raw, still recent by the biology of wherever he'd come from, and his movement through the house was faster, more deliberate. He was learning the layout. That was the horror of it. He was damaged, severely and progressively, but he retained enough to learn. He was remembering us. He was arriving with information from prior arrivals, carrying it through the fold the way you carry a scar, involuntarily, permanently, without any choice in the matter. He found Haley first. She was in her room with the door closed and the light on, doing the homework she actually did, which was the opposite of Jacob's approach. He went through the door without slowing down, just turned the handle and opened it with the calm of someone who has been there before, who knows the layout and knows where the children are and has arrived with purpose, however damaged that purpose might be. Haley screamed, and I came up the stairs 3 at a time with the suppressor Nikolai had built for my hands, smaller than his, recalibrated to my grip strength. One of the things he had done without being asked in the week following the third arrival, and I hit the doorframe hard enough to leave a bruise on my shoulder that stayed for 2 weeks. What happened in that room I will account for completely, because it matters. He grabbed for Haley. Jacob came from the other direction, from his own room, from the hall, faster than I had any right to expect, and put himself between them. The figure in white caught Jacob across the face. It was not a punch. It was something with the edge of the hand, a motion that wasn't quite a human motion, that had the quality of a movement learned and repeated and stripped of all its original meaning until only the mechanism remained. Jacob went down. A gash opened along Jacob's left cheekbone, deep, clean-edged, the kind that would require stitches and would leave a scar. And the figure stopped. He stopped and he stood over Jacob, and he looked at Jacob bleeding on the floor of Haley's room, and his face did something I cannot fully describe, a movement that was not quite expression, not quite recognition, but something between the two, something below cognition. Something the damage had not reached, in the way that certain things survive in a person through everything that should have destroyed them. The way a man can lose most of himself to time or injury or abuse, and still have the particular sound of his mother's voice somewhere in the architecture of what remains. He looked at Jacob, the way you look at something you know from before. I suppressed him. I had the unit at the right distance and angle, the technique Nikolai had drilled with me until it was something I could do without thinking. The figure in white went out in the white light. The ozone smell, the other smell. Jacob sat up on the floor of Haley's room with blood running down his cheek, and Haley was in the corner by the window with her knees pulled to her chest, and I stood in the doorway with the suppressor still running in my hand and the bruise forming on my shoulder. And I looked at my children in that room and understood something I had been moving toward for days. I need to know everything, I said to Nikolai, when the children were settled and we were alone in the kitchen. He told me. He told me everything he'd found in the CamSET data, pulling it up on his laptop as he talked, documents and logs and acquisition files that he walked me through with the same methodical care he'd used when explaining the fold. I listened to all of it. Some of what he said I had begun to suspect. Some of it I had no frame for. And one piece of it I want to set down with precision, because it is the piece that changed what I did next. The subject's CamSET was sending through the fold were prisoners. That was the term in the internal documentation, alongside the more clinical term, subjects. The sourcing was prisoners, people who had been taken, or who had agreed under conditions that could not fairly be called consent by any definition of consent that involved genuine freedom, or who had been identified through resonance profiling and acquired by methods the documentation described in language so bloodless and administrative that it took 3 readings to understand that the language described kidnapping, detained, transferred, enrolled. The language of institutional process, wrapped around the fact of people taken from their lives and put into a machine that sent them through time and called them subjects. And one of the prisoners, one of the subjects in the current trial sequence, the one being sent repeatedly, the one that kept coming back to our house, had been identified in the acquisition file by a notation that indicated he had attempted to destroy CamSET's primary facility, had tried to bomb it, had been caught in the attempt, subdued, and enrolled in the trial sequence as a particularly resilient subject, which was the documentation's way of saying he had survived more transit cycles than any previous subject without ceasing to function. The reason given in the acquisition file for the bombing attempt, retaliation for the death of a family member, specifically for the death of his mother. Nikolai showed me the acquisition photograph. The boy in the photograph was 16, maybe 17. His face was unlined and clear. The damage that I had seen through my living room hadn't happened yet in the photograph, or the photograph had been taken before it had accumulated fully except for a scar along the left cheekbone. New in the photograph, pink at the edges. Recent. I had put that scar there, 3 days ago, in Haley's room, when the figure in white had cut Jacob across the face, and I had watched the matching scar appear on the figure in white simultaneously, watched it form on older skin the way a wound forms when you press too hard on a bruise. The man in white was Jacob. I need to stop here. I need to say that again, and I need to not move past it too quickly, because the first time you encounter that fact it does not hold all the weight it carries. The man in white was my son, the damaged, transit-scrambled, brain-deteriorated figure who had been coming through my walls for weeks, who had grabbed for Haley and cut Jacob's face, and moved through my house with the indifference of something that no longer entirely recognized the world it was moving through. That was my son. Not a stranger, not a random subject from CamSET's pool. My son, in some version of the future that was already built, that was already in motion, that was arriving in my house in flashes of white light on a schedule I hadn't chosen, and couldn't halt by any means available to me from my side of the fold. My 14-year-old son was asleep down the hall with a new wound on his face. In the future, that wound would scar and his mother would die in some version of events that I hadn't reached yet but was heading toward. And he would try to destroy the people who'd done it and get caught and be put in a machine and sent through time repeatedly until the machine turned him into what had been coming through my walls. I sat in the kitchen for a very long time. Nikolai sat across from me and did not try to fill the silence. This was one of the things I valued most in him, the willingness to let silence be silence when silence was what was needed. After a while I said, "How do I go through the fold?" "Madison." "How? Tell me how." "It would require recalibrating the suppressor, inverting its function. Instead of destabilizing an arrival anchor, it generates one. You'd be generating your own transit event rather than responding to someone else's. But you'd need a target frequency, a specific fold address which corresponds to a specific location in the facility. I don't have the address. Without it, you'd be going in without a coordinate lock. Where does blind get me? Somewhere in the CamSET facility. Somewhere in the forward timeline, I can give you an approximate temporal target based on the transit signatures we've been recording, but approximate is not precise. You'd be in the facility, but I can't tell you where in the building or what you'd encounter on arrival. But inside their operation. Almost certainly, yes. And if I find him, if I find Jacob, the one they have. Physical contact. Nikolai's voice was careful and exact in the way of someone delivering information they would rather not deliver. Both people need to be in physical contact when the return transit triggers. If you find him and you can get hands on him, and I trigger the return from this end simultaneously with closing the anchor, he stopped. Started again. There's a version of this where the loop breaks, where future Jacob never ends up in that facility, where the arrival events stop because the sequence never fully assembles. And the version where it doesn't work. He held my gaze. You don't come back. I thought about Jacob asleep down the hall with a new scar forming on his face. I thought about Haley in the corner of her room with her knees pulled up. I thought about the thing that had been my son, moving through my house in a white gown, brain-scrambled and violence-driven, unable to stop being sent back through the fold, because the damage had made him resilient in the way that only certain kinds of prolonged suffering can produce. The kind of resilience that is not strength, but the simple failure to die on a schedule someone else set. I thought about the handprint on the dining room wall that I had painted over. I thought about Jacob's fist through his bedroom door. I thought about the photograph in the acquisition file. 16, maybe 17. The scar still new. "Calibrate it," I said. Nikolai calibrated the suppressor. It took most of the night. He worked at the kitchen table with his components spread around him in the organized way of someone who has a system, who has always had a system, who keeps things in order because order is the thing between you and chaos when your work involves the edges of what physics permits. He worked in silence for the most part, with the concentrated quiet of someone who is using every part of his mind and cannot afford to split it. I watched him work. I made coffee that neither of us drank. At one point he stopped and looked up at me across the kitchen table, and I thought he was going to argue, going to say there was another way, going to ask me to consider the children, going to present an alternative I could accept, and I shook my head very slightly and held his gaze until he understood. Then he went back to his work. I wrote 2 letters, one to Jacob, one to Haley. I wrote them by hand on paper from the printer tray in my regular handwriting, the writing I used for shopping lists and reminders, because I wanted them to be ordinary looking if they were found, if they needed to be read. I wrote them the way you write things you intend never to be read, which is to say honestly, completely. Without the management of feelings that I applied to everything I said to them out loud, the calibration, the reassurance, the careful shaping of the truth toward something they could carry. On paper, in a letter, I said all of it. What they were to me. What the years had been like. What I knew about each of them that I'd never said, the specific and detailed knowledge a parent accumulates of a child that has nowhere to go except inward. I left them in the kitchen drawer under the takeout menus, where Jacob looked when he needed a pen, and Haley never went. I sat with Haley until she fell asleep. She had asked me 6 times during the day if we were going to be okay, and 6 times I had said yes. The 7th time she asked it, she was already half asleep, the question floating up from somewhere near the surface of sleep, more reflex than request, and I smoothed her hair back from her face and said yes one more time with everything I had. I stood in Jacob's doorway for a while and watched him sleep. He slept with his fist closed, even at 14, not tightly, just closed, the particular configuration of someone who has learned that rest is not the same as safety. The new wound on his cheek was dark at the edges in the bad light from the hallway. He had my mother's hands and his father's jaw and a temper that was his own, that I had stopped blamming on his father years ago. He was going to be all right. He was the kind of person who was going to be all right even after everything, who was going to find the stubborn thing in himself and hold onto it. I believed that then. I still believe it. I went back to the kitchen. Nikolai handed me the recalibrated unit. It looked the same. It weighed slightly more, he told me, because of the additional components he'd added for the inversion. He stood in front of me, and he didn't say anything at first. And I didn't say anything at first. And we stood in the kitchen of the house I was probably going to lose to the bank in 3 months. The house that was about to swallow me into whatever came next. And what passed between us in that silence was the kind of communication that does not have language and does not need it. "Give yourself 30 seconds when you arrive," he said. "Before you move, before you try to do anything. Transit disorientation is severe and it will pass, but you have to wait it out or you'll make decisions in the wrong direction." Okay. Physical contact to return. Both hands if you can manage it. I'll be monitoring from this end, and I'll trigger the close as soon as I see your transit signature on the return. Okay. Madison. He stopped. He looked at me the way he'd looked at Jacob through the telescope in the backyard, with the unhurried attention of someone who has nowhere else to be. "I'll be here when you come back." "I know," I said. I triggered the fold. The white light was not what I'd expected, not the pulse and fade of the arrivals. It was slower and more total, a whiteness that built from the edges of the room inward, consuming the familiar surfaces of the kitchen in a deliberate and unhurried progression. The cabinets, the countertop, the coffee mugs, Nikolai's face last of all, watching me until the white took that too. Then there was a period I cannot describe in terms of time or space, because I was not in time or space in any form I had previous experience with. Nikolai had been right. It felt like nothing. And then it felt like everything. Every sensation available to a human nervous system compressed into a single interval without duration, frictionless, without hierarchy. Every memory I had ever had present at once and equally available. My children's voices at all their ages simultaneously. My mother's kitchen, Jacob learning to walk, Haley laughing at something I couldn't see, everything at once, and then it ended. I was standing in a corridor. Wide, white-walled, lit from above by ceiling panels that produced the particular quality of light found in facilities designed for work that nobody outside is supposed to see. Doors at regular intervals. No windows. The air was cool and had a slight antiseptic note underlying the old unnamed smell, stronger here than I'd ever encountered it, present everywhere. The ambient smell of a place that folds spacetime for a living, and has done it long enough that the smell is in the walls. I gave myself 30 seconds. I counted them out slowly, standing in the middle of that corridor, and the disorientation resolved itself in stages the way a developing photograph resolves itself. The nausea, the spatial confusion, the sense of not being correctly oriented to gravity. Then clarity, arriving from the edges inward, the reverse of the white light. Then I moved. The facility was larger than I'd expected. 3 wrong turns in the first 3 minutes, 3 different research spaces glimpsed through reinforced glass, banks of equipment whose function I couldn't name from the outside, server arrays running cool white indicator lights in long rows, what appeared to be a medical bay with a table and equipment I didn't look at for long. No people in any of them. The corridor system was quiet in the way that suggests an off-shift or a skeleton crew. Not the quiet of an empty building, but the quiet of a building where most of the people are elsewhere. I moved along it with the suppressor held close to my body, and the particular alertness of someone who has been woken enough times by things coming through walls to have internalized what danger feels like in the air before it shows itself. I found the holding section on the 3rd level down. The stairs were concrete and institutional, the kind that care about function and nothing else, the kind that exist in buildings where the people who use them are not there by choice. The holding section had a door with a magnetic lock and a badge reader. I cleared the lock the way Nikolai had shown me. The door opened. A row of rooms behind reinforced doors, each with a small window at eye level. Most were empty. In the 4th one I found him. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the far wall, knees pulled up, face down toward the floor. The white gown was intact here, cleaner. Earlier in whatever sequence they'd been running him through. The surgical scars on his skull were present, and the scar on his cheekbone was there, healed to silver. He was not moving. He was doing the Jacob stillness, sitting completely still at the center of chaos, inside himself somewhere unreachable. The same stillness I'd seen in his doorway at 14 and in Haley's room and in the kitchen on the floor after the 3rd arrival. I put my hand against the glass. He looked up. And there it was, the thing I had seen in the living room and in Haley's room, the thing behind the damage, the thing the transit cycles had not been able to reach no matter how many times they sent him through. Recognition. Not the clean, immediate recognition of before everything had happened. Something that had been compressed and buried deep, pushed below the deterioration and the months or years of CamSET's management of him. But it was there, like a signal through interference. Like a specific frequency that could still be found if you knew exactly where to look. I worked the lock. He was on his feet by the time the door opened, and he was larger in person without the disorientation of arrival distorting my perception. 6'3", broad in the shoulders, taller than his father had been, his father who had left and never come back. He was my son. He was 40% damaged and 60% present, and he was my son. I said his name. His actual name. The one I had chosen 14 years before because I thought it suited him and had been proven right. I said it the way I'd said stop in the living room, with the full weight of everything behind it, not just the word but the specific voice of the specific person he'd known all his life, the one he'd been hearing since before he had language for it. Something in him answered. He took one step toward me and I took one step toward him, and I got both hands on his arms, both of mine, gripping, and I triggered the return fold. The transit with two was different in every way that mattered. The 8 seconds of nothing and everything were longer, or felt longer, stretched by the resistance of two temporal signatures being forced into alignment. The fold pushed back. It was not designed for this, not designed for a return transit, not designed for two, and it expressed its objection as a kind of structural pressure, like trying to push two magnets together at the same pole, that continuous resistance that asks whether you're sure, whether you're going to hold. I held. I held through the pressure and the disorientation and the sense that the fold was going to lose one of us, was going to separate our signatures and send each to a different point, and I would arrive home to find myself alone. I held because he was my son and I was his mother, and that was the oldest and most durable fact available to me, a fact that had survived more than the fold would throw at it, a fact that had survived 3 years of practical disaster, and a house being taken from us and a husband choosing to leave, and things coming through the walls at 2 in the morning. I held because that was all I had and it was enough. We came through in the kitchen. Nikolai was waiting. He had the anchor suppressor running at full gain before we fully resolved, already in position, already running the counter frequency into the fold point, ready for us. I felt the moment the anchor let go, a physical release, like pressure equalizing, like coming up from depth, the kind of sensation that is almost pleasant in its completeness. The white light collapsed inward and was gone. The kitchen was quiet. Jacob, my Jacob, 14, asleep when I'd left, had come out of his room at some point, alerted by the transit event or by Nikolai's activity. He was standing in the doorway to the kitchen in his socks, looking at the version of himself standing in the middle of the room. Neither of them moved. They looked at each other the way mirrors look at each other when you put them face to face. The same thing at different points, the same architecture under different accumulations of time and damage and experience. The future version looked down at his younger self for a long, motionless moment. Then he raised one hand, very slowly, and pressed 2 fingers against his own cheekbone, against the old, silver-heeled version of the scar that the younger Jacob carried raw and new on his face. Then he looked at me. I cannot tell you what I saw in that look. I've tried in the months since to find the right words and none of them are right. What I can tell you is this. It was not the look of a man who had been destroyed. It was the look of a man who had survived something that should have destroyed him and was standing in his mother's kitchen looking at what his face had looked like before and was not okay, would not be okay for a long time, perhaps never completely, but was present, accounted for, returned. Nikolai closed the fold. He ran the suppressor through its full cycle 3 times at 3 different frequencies, until the anchor readings on his equipment flatlined and stayed flat. The old unnamed smell faded from the house over the following hours, slowly, the way a fever breaks, not in a single moment but by degrees, measurable in the increments of a returning normal. By dawn, the air was just air. By morning, the kitchen smelled like coffee and the slightly sweet smell of old wood in an old house, the smell it had always had before. Haley slept through all of it. She came down in the morning and found a man she'd never seen sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee he hadn't touched. She looked at him for a long time in the careful evaluating way of 9-year-olds who are deciding something. Then she looked at Jacob and then at me. "Is he staying?" she said. "For a while," I said. She considered this seriously, with the weight she gave things that deserved weight. "Does he want eggs?" He did not answer, because the verbal function had been hit hard and was slow to return, and in that moment it was not fully available. But he looked at her with those returning eyes, and something in the damaged and healing architecture of his face moved in a direction that was not quite a smile, but was the place smiles come from. And Haley, 9 years old and in possession of a resilience I would spend years being grateful for, accepted this as an answer and got the eggs out of the refrigerator. The arrivals stopped. We waited 3 weeks before anyone said it out loud. Nikolai first, with the qualifications of a man who had learned to be careful about certainty, and then me, and then Jacob, who said it simply. They've stopped. No more lights at 2 in the morning. No more ozone and old smell in the downstairs. No more Haley asking for the 7th time. Nikolai's equipment confirmed what we felt in the house and in our own bodies. The fold was closed. The anchor was gone. Whatever sequence had been building, escalating, degrading, always returning, it had been broken at its origin point. The loop had no entry anymore. CamSET sent a new acquisition notice 6 weeks later. I used the data Nikolai had extracted, the prisoner logs, the transit documentation, the sourcing files with their bloodless language around the fact of kidnapping, and I sent it somewhere it needed to go. I will not be specific about where, because that part of the story belongs to other proceedings and is not entirely mine to own. What I will say is that CamSET's primary research facility was under federal seal within 90 days, and the acquisition notice was the last piece of correspondence I received from that company under any name. The bank still came for the house. We lost it in February, packed what we could, arranged what storage we could afford, moved to an apartment on the other side of the city with thin walls and a parking lot view and a heating system that rattled after midnight. Jacob helped carry boxes without being asked. He was getting his language back slowly, single words, then short phrases, then something closer to sentences with gaps and hesitations that might not fully close. He chose to sleep on the couch the first week by preference, without a door between himself and the rest of us. I didn't argue. He's been back in a room since March. He's working with a therapist who came recommended by Nikolai and who is patient in the way that patience looks when it's a professional commitment rather than a personal one, steady, without expectation of a particular pace. Jacob goes every Thursday. He doesn't talk much about what they discuss. That's his. On the first clear night in the apartment, he came to stand beside me at the kitchen window. We didn't have a view worth mentioning, a parking lot, the side wall of another building, a strip of sky caught between roof lines. But there were stars in the strip, a few of them, bright against the city light. He stood there for a while without speaking. Outside, a car moved through the lot below us, its headlights sweeping across the asphalt in an ordinary arc. Nothing unusual, nothing coming through the walls. Then he said slowly, with the care he took now with words, the way you take care with things that cost you something. Thank you. 2 words. Clean and exact and carrying everything behind them. Everything that had been narrowly missed. Every version of the future that had been closed off. Every arrival in the night and every morning after. Every letter in the kitchen drawer that I'd retrieved and burned without reading again, because what I'd put in them was for a contingency that hadn't come to pass and didn't need to be revisited. I put my hand on his arm. We stood at the window for a while. The strip of sky had more stars in it than I'd expected from a city window. The parking lot was still. The building across the way was dark in most of its windows. The night held nothing it shouldn't. We were just a family in an apartment. That was enough. That was, in the full accounting of the preceding months, a spectacular amount. That was the thing I had carried through the fold and back again, the thing that had not broken in transit, had not been lost in the pressure and the 8 seconds of everything at once, had arrived intact on the other side. They were mine. I was theirs. No future that either of us could be sent to was going to change that. I had made sure of it. The fold had taught me something about time that the physicists and the CamSET documents hadn't covered. Time is not the straight line it presents itself as from the inside. It folds. It loops. It sends things back through itself and they arrive changed beyond recognition. But underneath all of it, underneath the arrivals and the damage and the transit signatures and the anchor points, there are things that hold their shape, things that don't fold. A mother looking for her son in the dark. That particular thing does not fold. I've thought about it since, and I've concluded it's because it's older than anything CamSET was working with, Older than their equipment, older than the theory, older than the mathematics of it. Some things predate the fold. Some things will be there when the fold is gone. The parking lot below was still and empty. The night was ordinary. We stood at the window and watched the stars.